So thank you again to Stanford for hosting this event, and thank you to the organizers for scheduling it for nice and early at 4:30, which is still within my realm, coming from New York, so I'm not yet in my bedtime, which I appreciate very much. So what I'll be presenting to you today are the global findings of the Freedom on the Net report. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term internet freedom, it's the simple notion that the same rights that are held by people offline must be protected online. Each year, we work with a team of local contributors from 65 countries to assess how easily individuals can access the internet, whether it is censored, and how their fundamental rights of freedom of expression and privacy are restricted by both state and non-state actors. What I'll be walking you through today is I'll start with the improvements and declines of the countries that we cover. Then I'll go through the three global trends that Eileen has already mentioned pertaining to disinformation, data protection, and the ways that China is exporting digital authoritarianism around the world. And I will try very hard to close on a more positive note relating to what can be done to reverse some of the very alarming trends that I'm going to go through today. Here's a map of the 65 countries that we cover. You'll recognize some of the typical Freedom House colors of the map. Green are free countries, yellow is partly free, and purple is not free. Gray are those countries that we did not assess, but the 65 countries that we cover translates to approximately 87% of the world's internet user population. And you'll notice how much of the map is purple, which is unfortunate, obviously, but to give you a sense of what conditions are like in the not free countries, these are places where the internet is highly censored, where foreign and independent news sites are blocked, where companies come under very heavy responsibilities to censor political, social, and religious speech, where individuals, journalists, civil society activists are arrested for nonviolent views that they post online, and where there is heavy, unchecked surveillance of online communications. At least 1/3 of all internet users around the world experience the internet in this way. The vast majority of those are based in China, which again ranked as the worst offender for internet freedom in 2018, followed by Iran and Syria. On the other side of the spectrum, of course, there's Iceland and Estonia, which are once again tied for first place, followed by Canada, Germany, and Australia. And the United States ranked in sixth place, but declined 1 point over the past year due to the repeal of net neutrality regulations. And we've also noticed that disinformation and hyper-partisan content continues to pollute the public sphere, especially around ahead of the midterm elections, where there's really been no sign of things abating since the 2016 elections. Interestingly, almost half of all declines over the past year took place around elections, which really underlines this notion that elections have become a sort of flashpoint for internet freedom restrictions. So in the year and months ahead of the election, governments oftentimes pass new laws around cybersecurity, hate speech, counterterrorism, that have very broad provisions pertaining to online speech. And then these are used oftentimes against political opponents, independent media, in order to silence speech and sway the public views towards enthusiasm for the government. Generally speaking, the two countries that had, I should say that the steepest declines took place in Egypt and Sri Lanka, followed by Cambodia, Kenya, Nigeria, the Philippines, and Venezuela. So some fragile democracies in there as well. And interestingly, the two countries with the greatest declines, Egypt and Sri Lanka, really symbolize the two sides of the coin of how disinformation and false news reports are harming internet freedom, which brings me to the first of our global trends. So on the one hand, propagandists and populists have really grown adept at using digital tools to manipulate online conversations and control the media narrative in their own countries. The number of countries in which pro-government trolls manipulate online conversations rose to 32 out of the 65 countries that we cover. That's the most that we've ever seen since we've begun tracking this in 2009. And we covered this phenomenon in last year's report, but what I'd like to emphasize is that not only has this practice become more widespread, it has really changed in scale as well and in terms of impact. Notably, we've seen violence being incited against minorities in countries like Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India, and Bangladesh. And it's also moved from open platforms like Facebook to more closed messaging platforms like WhatsApp, where it may be more difficult to spot and combat. In Sri Lanka, which shows one side of the coin, rumors and disinformation sparked vigilante violence that predominantly targeted the Muslim community. The inundation of hate led to authorities shutting down social media platforms for 2 days. On your right is a screenshot from Facebook. This was one of the false news reports that was shared on social media that claimed that members of the Muslim minority were stuffing, and food vendors were stuffing sterilization pills into the food that was being served to the Sinhalese majority. And there's also a video that you can find where there's a Sinhalese individual going up to a poor Muslim food vendor and asking, are there sterilization pills in this food, and kind of pressuring him to answer. And the gentleman didn't really understand and sort of was like, yeah, like whatever you like. And then this video was then used to incite greater violence and share this false rumor that somehow food was unsafe in the country. There was also this tweet from a government minister in Sri Lanka who stated that hate speech on Facebook is increasing beyond acceptable levels. And if you're wondering, like many Sri Lankans, what are acceptable levels of hate speech, he quickly walked that back and was like, I didn't mean that way. My bad. No hate speech is acceptable. On the other side, governments like Egypt are using the term fake news as a pretext to curb free expression in the country. Egypt is really one of the worst offenders in this regard, and that's why I picked it out for this slide. Authorities have blocked over 500 websites over the past year, including those of prominent news websites and human rights groups. They've undertaken a harsh crackdown on even mild forms of criticism of the government, as we can see from some of the examples shown on this slide. In the year when the hashtag #MeToo movement really gained prominence around the world, 2 women were arrested in Egypt for nothing more than sharing a video on Facebook in which they were talking about the sexual harassment that they had endured in the country and criticizing the government for not doing enough for protecting women's rights. And for those videos, they were arrested by Egyptian authorities and charged with spreading false information that defamed the government. Similarly, after Masal al-Arabiya published a translated New York Times article about Egypt's flawed elections, its offices were raided and its editor-in-chief was also arrested for allegedly spreading false news. And unfortunately, this is really only going to get even worse in Egypt. Over the past year, authorities passed a new law that requires all social media users with over 5,000 followers to now register with the government as a traditional media outlet. So we're seeing that in countries with some of the worst press freedom records in the world, they're now treating social media users like the traditional press. So it really foreshadows a greater crackdown that we're going to see on online media. Sorry. Ironically, it's oftentimes some of the same governments that criminalize the spread of false information that are guilty of propagating fake news themselves. After we saw the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul, it was very noticeable to see how Saudi bots and trolls were springing into action. There was some fantastic reporting about a troll farm based outside of Riyadh that was controlled by a Saudi minister which has been very active in terms of spreading a different narrative around what happened that day in Istanbul, and also in terms of smearing all government opponents that are based outside of the country. And then, very ironically, the public prosecutor that month issued a reminder that spreading false news can result in a 5-year prison sentence under the draconian cybercrime law. And of course, you can imagine what sort of chilling effect these sort of warnings have on online speech. That brings me to the second global finding on how demands by authorities to gain access, on demands by authorities to gain tighter control over data. This slide features a simple graphic showing just the scale of the problem at hand. It's become obvious to the public that as more and more data is being collected about us, it's harder and harder to secure. These are some of the largest data breaches that happened over the past year. The largest one is in India, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But really what we've seen is that as governments recognize the importance of data flowing in and outside of their countries, they're establishing new rules and barriers in the name of national sovereignty. So governments in 18 countries passed new laws or directives to increase state control over data, either by requiring that companies provide the means to decrypt their users' data, or by obliging them to store the data on servers located inside of the country. And this comes at a time where we saw one of the more positive things, which was the implementation of the GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulations, in the EU, which was a new framework for protecting individuals' data. At the same time, many countries are passing these so-called data protection laws that do the opposite of protecting data. In reality, they make it far easier for the authorities, often in countries with weak rule of law, like in Russia or in China, to then gain access to data without any judicial safeguards. And as a case in point, India, which is now proposing data localization laws, has this new system called the Aadhaar biometric database. And there was a breach in the system which left the data of 1.1 billion Indian citizens vulnerable to being exposed. Our third and final trend relates to how China is refining its model of digital authoritarianism at home and has become more assertive in exporting it around the globe. It's been interesting. This has been the one finding that's really attracted the most attention of the launch, which was just on Thursday, including by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself. At a press conference, a journalist had asked a spokesperson from the Chinese MFA, had they read the report and what do they think about it? And interestingly enough, the spokesperson said, yes, we have read the report. And it's obviously just based on lies. It's obviously done with by an organization that has ulterior motives, as if the protecting of human rights is an ulterior motive to China. This graphic shows an overview of the so-called China model of internet control. From the very beginning that China introduced the internet in the country, it sought to keep it under very tight control. The so-called Great Firewall is an alarmingly effective apparatus of both censorship and surveillance. And this year saw the passage of a highly restrictive cybersecurity law that, among other things, requires companies to store data about their local customers on servers based within the country. What we saw was that Apple, over the past year, was forced into compliance with this law, which meant that it had to partner with a state-owned company, which was now holding all of Chinese iCloud users' data on their servers. And we can imagine how Apple, which has often portrayed itself as a very strong defender of privacy, when it comes to China, it's playing by very different rules. There's also been an alarming uptick in internal repression in regions like Xinjiang, where the Muslim minority is heavily surveilled using facial recognition technology and spyware apps that they're required to install on their phones, which allows the authorities to then look at all of the files that the Muslim minority have stored on their devices. And what's really new this year is that Beijing is investing considerable resources to woo government officials and media elites around the world. We actually found that in the 65 countries that we cover, 36 sent representatives to China for 2 and 3 week trainings on new media management and information systems. For example, media officials from the Philippines visited China for 2 weeks on a training that was, quote, on new media development and also socialist journalism with Chinese characteristics. Similar trainings have been held for senior media staff from 8 Middle Eastern countries. And it's unclear exactly what happens during these seminars. I'm sure they're fed very well and led on tours throughout the country. But we do know that when Vietnamese officials visited China in April 2017, it wasn't long before Vietnam actually passed its own cybersecurity law that bore a strong resemblance to China's own cybersecurity law. We've really seen that officials in Beijing are hoping to cultivate allies to follow its lead on global internet policy, and that the government is investing heavily in R&D and AI and wants China actually to become an AI powerhouse by 2030. Its companies are also now the leading manufacturers of telecommunications equipment and also of surveillance equipment in the world. We identified projects by either private or state-owned Chinese companies to develop large-scale telecommunications projects in 38 of the 65 countries that we cover. Much of this is part of the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which is this $1 trillion development plan to remake remake the world in China's image. And we also saw that in 18 countries, Chinese surveillance companies like Hikvision and CloudWalk are selling facial recognition technology that uses artificial intelligence to identify and monitor citizens. Here are some of the countries where these 3 different dynamics are taking place. And here's a screenshot actually from a demonstration of one of these surveillance companies. And you can see that here in red, there is this box showing that this facial recognition technology is able to identify whether the subject is an ethnic minority or not. And we can see, given what's already happening in places like Xinjiang province, that these tools are being used effectively to persecute the marginalized groups that do not, let's say, that pose some sort of ideological threat to the Chinese regime. So I promise I try to end on a positive note. And this is going to be what we talk about on our panel: what can be done to counter digital authoritarianism and defend internet freedom. We've compiled a comprehensive set of recommendations that can be seen in the booklet, but and we have some bullet points here on the right. But I think at this stage, and especially after a presentation like this, it's really important to remember how the internet can still be an effective tool for deposing authoritarian leaders and rallying people to the streets for democratic change. On the right, we can see how digital tools were crucial to Armenia's so-called Velvet Revolution, when hundreds of thousands took to the streets. Digital tools also played a very important role in Ethiopia's prime minister stepping down and the relaxation of restrictions there. And digital activists in the Gambia played a role in pushing long-standing President Yahya Jammeh from power. And as you can see from this tweet, for a very brief moment, discussions about Jammeh were just as popular as Will Smith and Baywatch, which is no easy feat. So on that note, I'll close and I'll turn it over to the panel, where I'm sure that we'll have a very lively discussion about all these things. And if you do want to get in touch, here's my email address, and then also a reminder that reports on all 65 countries that we cover, these are very long reports that we spend a lot of time on. We have a whole team in New York editing these, as well as the graphics and data that was included in this slide, given that how small it appeared, is all available on our website, freedomonthenet.org. Thank you.